So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today Simon Bradley. Simon manages his own marketing consulting agency. Was a former SVP of marketing strategy and engagement at Madison Square Gardens. Headed up marketing for North America for Virgin Atlantic, and is, to our great pleasure, one of our faculty members at NYU School of Professional Studies. So absolutely gives me great distinct pleasure to welcome Simon. And I thought I'd open it up, Simon, just by asking you a little bit about your background and your experience. You've moved between countries and continents, etc. And then get into some conversation about marketing at a time of crisis and what we can learn. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Michael. So quick bit about me. So as you can tell, I'm not a New Yorker either. So I originate from the UK. A lot of my background is on the client side, working for brands in sort of travel, tourism, entertainment, and sports. So I worked for Virgin Atlantic Airways here in the US for 5 years, heading up all of their marketing. I headed up marketing at Madison Square Garden company as well. And now I run my own consulting company and work with clients across the map in all sorts of different fields. And I suppose at a time like this, you start to think back to all of the kind of consolidated experience that you have in kind of working through crises. And as I was thinking about it, there's actually quite a lot, unfortunately or fortunately, that I've been involved with, and picked up some learnings and developed some muscles along the way of that. So hopefully we'll talk a bit about that today as well.
Well, especially I think it's going to be relevant is the airline industry, which sees these kind of cyclical shocks from time to time, whether it's economic or terrorism or whatever it is. It's it might be you probably were working at Virgin at a time when some of those hit. So so let's start there, Simon. What when you look back on that, very I won't say long, so that make you sound old, but a very rich, full career already. What kind of big shocks to the system have you seen and that you've helped either other marketers work through, or you yourself had to work through, and what do you think we can learn from some of those?
Yeah, so quite a few. I'll call out a couple that are sort of relevant to where we are now. One of the biggest that I remember, which you'll probably remember this as well, Michael, was the foot and mouth outbreak in the UK in the early 2000s. Which was confined to the UK, but decimated local economies, because it was kind of similar to where we are now, because they actually shut down whole tracts of countryside and different parts of the country, business had to close. So that was a big one for me. I was working in the tourism industry at the time. Obviously, the recession, the last recession, 2008, 2009 recession, that was a big one. I was just going into the airline industry at the time and just trying to grapple with how do you haul yourself kind of out of that. And then the volcano, the Icelandic volcano, which you mentioned the airline industry. One of the good things about working in the airline industry is that you kind of have one of these almost every year, one way or another, because you're so susceptible to these things. Sometimes they're of your own making. Sometimes it's a weather event like a snowstorm. Other times it's a huge global event like the recession. But you sort of get used to being in that mode of adapting. So learn quite a bit from that. And I think one of the biggest things that I've been talking about is preparedness and resilience. There are brands that go into these crisis situations that actually come out better than when they went in, right? And a study by Harvard Business Review found in the last recession that only 9% of companies, but still 9%, actually came out of the global recession better than when they went in. And so they looked at some of the factors around that. And I think a big one is this sort of inbuilt resilience within the company, that they have a strong brand, loyal customer base, great culture, they're adaptable, and they seem to fare better than some other companies. And I think we're sort of seeing that at the moment as well, right?
Yeah. So to some extent, that's about, how well prepared you are already, as opposed to anything you can do in the moment or in the crisis itself.
Yeah, it's sort of, I think it's two things. It's preparedness, but then there's also how you can respond as well. And
right.
the CEO of Delta actually put it very, very nicely, where he talked about they're continually building a muscle
right.
to help them be better each time. And as they go, they try and learn. And so you do see some companies being very, very effective in how they respond as well. And that builds, I think, probably builds brand equity and loyalty at the same time.
And what were some of the examples, either things you saw and admired or things you yourself, did that you think had some kind of, enduring value for the brand, or, were meaningful at some level to consumers? It may be, at least in brand, but maybe also in profit and revenue.
Yeah, I think a big one for me is really leaning into being as helpful and being as customer focused as you can be at a time like that, because people don't forget that, and right. You see, certainly I've seen in the past that where you can really help your customers, you can go above and beyond for them to provide extra value at a critical kind of moment of truth that they're in. That can reap rewards, frankly, later on, but also can position you very well in terms of keeping those relationships alive. So I saw a lot of that kind of behavior. I see value in more sort of the communications-based performance marketing, that kind of thing, during a time like this. And there are lots of examples of companies like Target, who were, in the last recession, for example, they increased their marketing spend by 20%, right. And they came out of it with their profits up by 40%. So there are examples of that, but I think it's also building that foundation of goodwill with customers that can really work. And you see that now, right? You see right. The brands which are coming out. There's a great example in Ireland. In Ireland, they're bringing back expat health workers to try and grapple with this crisis that they're in. Mm. And so two brands, Renault and AXA Insurance, have come together to provide cars for these workers who are back in their country temporarily, right? And right. That's the sort of thing where people won't forget that. And right. It's those sorts of behaviors that I think, are really powerful at a time like this.
And do you think that's sort of more important perhaps than, how much you spend on advertising and the message in the advertising? Because a lot of those things arguably are good things that, would be done as goodwill, even if we don't talk about them. I know there are big companies today spending a lot of money where CEOs have chosen that's not what we're going to talk about because we're doing that because it's the right thing to do. But so what's the balance, you think, or what did you see in the past for, getting credit for doing good and just doing good?
Yeah, and also performance marketing as well to actually right. drive business. And I've been using this term a lot of sort of offense and defense, right? So right. The smart companies during a time like this seem to be able to balance the two, right? So that they on the defense side, they're doing things which are going to protect their brands. They're launching CSR programs. They're doing good. But then on the offense side, they're being very smart about very, very targeted marketing and product development in a way that seeks out those opportunities that exist for them. So back to Target in the last recession, a good example because they circled the wagons and they were very effective on the defense side, but then also they in fact developed their food offering quite substantially during the last recession because they saw growth in people who needed essentials or demand for essentials versus growth for discretionary products. So they right. pivoted and they grew their food offering. And as a result, they did very well from that. So I think that kind of behavior of the offense defense is the smart way of approaching it.
I think that's a great segue to a question about market research, I guess, really, which is, during a time of crisis, I mean, I've heard some folks say, don't believe a word you hear, during a time of crisis, consumer sentiment bounces all over the place. It's very hard to read. It's very hard to read on any good given day. Consumers just say what they will do, and afterwards, etc. And in a time of crisis, particularly, and then even more so in a time of this crisis, where some of our behaviors are ones that have been compelled upon us. We're not choosing to stay home and watch more TV. We're here because we have to be for our health and safety. But so my question is really one about research and how you perhaps have navigated some of that in the past. How do you find that signal in the noise? So Target obviously saw something going on, something that actually then became important later. Yes, it was happening then, but they invested in it in order to have a business in these essential foods, etc. Obviously we're seeing on foods, we're seeing some of that as well. P&G announced fabulous results, and a lot of it is to do with the comfort food, the staples, I guess. So thinking about research, how do you, as a consumer of research or a commissioner of research, probably, how do you look at that and think about research in a time like this, and what's the signal from the noise?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard this sort of mantra before, but I'm a big subscriber to this mantra of listen, respond, listen again, right? And
right.
Research is part of that listening process, but it's all about for me, it's about trying to get a sort of 360 view of what's going on through research, through social listening, which is a tool that we now have that maybe we didn't have 10 years ago, right? So social listening is very powerful. Online behavior, and then also unstructured feedback from the front line, whether that's retail or customer service staff as well. And through that, when I was in the airline industry, for example, we used to gather a lot of intel through our sales teams, who were having informal conversations all the time with some of our top clients, and that was part of how we gathered the intel. So I agree with you. You can't. I mean, the numbers are helpful in terms of some of these trackers and surveys, but going beyond that is important. And when I've been talking to marketers about things that they're doing differently now, or the things that they've turned up, one of the big things that comes back is social listening. And people using that kind of natural language processing to be able to tune in, because that's where you get really what people are thinking and saying. And they're using that a lot to then adjust their behaviors as well. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very interesting discussion about the sort of blending of qual and quant research, where you have such a high volume of maybe it's unstructured, but of this data from social listening, that it could actually give you some real insights or patterns that we didn't necessarily have before, and may be a truer reveal of behavior than asking people, the 10-question survey type stuff. Yeah.
The other thing, Michael, as well is, and I'm sure I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but China, right? So we actually have, to some extent, we have a model to watch in terms of the future, because there's a part of the world that's ahead of where the Western world is. So I think China's an interesting one to watch. I mean, it's not, of course, totally comparable, but as you watch how demand has shifted in China, how behavior has shifted, and some of the fundamental changes that are going on there, and also how things are bouncing back as well, I think that's quite a useful monitor.
Right. Yeah, one feels that, and we can talk about this a little bit later about, what the future looks like, but there feels like we almost need to develop our own sort of set of probabilistic outcomes, like a lot of the health models that we're looking at now, and we all seem to be much more comfortable digesting this data, than probably. That's a whole other conversation about, our data literacy seems to have advanced enormously. But
what do you think about this? One thing I've been quite interested in is, the good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And how normally, as marketers, we try and kind of move our customers up it, or we respond to our customers moving up the old pyramid there. But actually, if you think about a crisis situation, all the pressure is downward, right? It's pushing people back down to things like survival and basic needs and all of that. And do you think that's got some sort of validity in how you might respond to that?
Well, I think the research suggests that people have switched. There's a bit more initially, at least, around things like, where do I get the food I need to feed my family? How do I stay safe and healthy? Will I have a job? Can I afford the mortgage? The research obviously was very clear about that. What the research I've seen a couple of different places is it was somewhat generational, so that younger people were much more concerned about the economy and their economic future in terms of getting a job and employment, and older people were significantly more concerned about their health and their safety of the family. But clearly there is this sort of reversion. But I think actually it is what you're seeing is these very interesting spikes, though, because you're also seeing a lot of people who are saying, okay, in this crazy world, I also need to think about my mental health, and I need to find ways to reconnect with my family, and I need to find ways to, find space for myself, etc. All those, which are much higher order needs, But one has to believe, with the level of structural unemployment that we now have, that for a vast number of people, or a much larger number of people, typically, consumption is a bit more about basic needs, and that advertisers and marketers should speak to that at some level.
I was chatting to a company the other day, and we were talking about how their segmentation model is shifting, and you almost have to sort of park your classic sort of or steady state segmentation model, and because in the depths of a crisis, there's sort of new segmentation model emerges, and we've seen this in previous crises where. And it's based upon how people are responding to what's in front of them right now, which might be different to how they normally behave.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two insights in there. One is you have to go back to segmentation. You have to say, the needs of our consumers will differ, and their concerns in this period will differ by those segments. Yeah. So you can't paint, one size fits all, and that within those segments they may have shifted, so they're not the old models don't work. There's very much a debate, it seems, well, not debate even, but general tone that you're going to have to throw out the old models, or at least not feel that you can rely on the old models, which is a scary time for marketers. I think a very scary time for all of us if we think there's a success formula. Clearly, though, some marketers, and maybe we can sort of segue a bit into what you're telling people to do now, so what counsel would you have for marketers right now, in terms of things like marketing spend or brand positioning, or any kind of new initiatives underway? So love you to share some thoughts a bit about that.
Yeah. So I think the number one thing that I've seen and that I would always encourage brands to do is, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, is stay really close to the customer at a time like this, and kind of take this customer first attitude. If you don't normally, do it now, because there's two things there. One, you need to know what people are thinking, and it's volatile, and being, your response this week could be totally inappropriate next week, right? So or vice versa. So understanding that is really, really important. And then also dialing up customer service touch points as well, and we've seen a lot of that. In fact, when I've surveyed marketers on this, the number two thing that they talk about is the amount that they're investing in their customer service touch points, because we now live in this world of 360 marketing and customer experience driving brand and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so you can really come undone if customer service is fallen by the wayside. So if you just look at how the banks have suffered through handling these small business loans, right? And big banks with big customer service departments are being unable to serve their customers at a critical time, and they're getting slaughtered for it. And people will remember that. So I think that's definitely a big one for me.
Yeah,
is dialing that up. Then the second thing is relevance. So most consumers are saying they don't mind brands communicating at the moment. They're quite happy to look at advertising and consume messages and all of that, as long as it's relevant to their situation and it's going to in some way help them during the time of the pandemic. So providing, rather than just providing sales-driven messages, providing solutions to problems. And there are lots of market opportunities out there, aren't there? where people want like webcams. People want webcams. I'm trying to get a new one. Can't get it. So there are lots of solutions that need, lots of problems that need solutions. And I think if companies are relevant in the way that they position themselves, that can be a real opportunity. And then the third thing I'd say to everybody is, you should be planning now for what's coming next and building out some scenarios in terms of, good, medium, bad, or whatever, however they plan normally. Creating some kind of scenario planning and then bringing assets together and being ready to hit the ground running when we start to see a recovery, which could be as soon as 3 weeks, when we actually start wanting to put some different messaging out into the marketplace.
Right. How do you, going back to this question of relevance, so relevance is a pillar and differentiation is kind of always a pillar. One of the critiques, and over this weekend, you may have seen LinkedIn had a mashup. There was a mashup someone put on LinkedIn of all the ads that most of the major advertisers are doing, and they all sort of seemed, it was a bit cruel, a bit of a low blow, but they all seem to, regress to the mean. They're all essentially saying the same thing. So, again, what kind of counsel have you given people, to the extent that they're calling on you in that area to think about how to position themselves? So relevant, clearly, but what about differentiation, and how can you meaningfully differentiate at a time where what you really just want to say is, we're with you, we're sympathetic, etc. But how do you do that?
I think a lot of brands are afraid at the moment, and they're afraid of making a misstep, or the company's afraid of making a misstep, and so they're almost, they're going to this sort of bland level, which as a safety net almost, and you're right, they sort of regress to the mean. I would call out the companies that have got, are being bolder and have got more guts and are actually putting themselves out there as solving problems. So it's a great example I picked up. Share a couple of examples with you, actually. One is in China. There's a company called JD.com, which is e-commerce company. They sell food and beverage. And what they've been doing is running these club nights through live streaming. And they've been beaming into people's houses with these DJs and these amazing club nights that have been going on throughout the shutdown. And at the same time, they've linked that to their e-commerce platform. So in advance of the club night, you can order all of your favorite alcohol and snacks into the house. The special offers. They partnered with some different alcohol brands.
Right.
And this thing has done incredibly well. And as a result, they're going to, even though people can start going out again, they're going to carry on doing this thing, right? So that's relevancy, and it's boldness, and it's not just, anodyne sort of messaging. It's really positive action, but it's also very kind of performance driven as well.
Yeah, so this is so it's interesting. I was reading in a completely different context about, I think, around marketing orientation, and that old, the very powerful notion that we as marketers need to start with market orientation, about the idea of things that are activity based and things that are results based. And I agree with you. I think that sounds like it's something which is being thought at the level of what result will this have, as opposed to, we feel we ought to do something. Which may be driving a lot of advertising and marketing today. Yeah. What are you? How are you informing yourself as a marketer? And what do you find is the most I mean, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm up at the crack of dawn looking at all these websites, and some of them, data directly, obviously about the spread of the disease, which is a direct human concern, but also about, what various companies are doing, and but maybe I'm not informing myself enough about consumers. How do you, what do you see companies doing, and how do you personally sort of keep yourself informed?
So I think there's a really broad spectrum of response. I'm fortunate that I still have clients right now who are wanting to do marketing, so I get to talk to them a lot. And even with that group, there's a spectrum of response and a spectrum of appetite for, do we try and carry on and not even mention this word, right? And that's certainly one school of thought, right through to let's lean in and let's try and make ourselves relevant because we're here with this for a while, so we may as well do that. And and I think that's the other thing is the companies that have figured out that this is going to be around for quite a while, this sort of behavior is going to be around for a while, have seen the need to go beyond just the we're with you sort of messaging. So that's a real spectrum. And it's interesting. You see quite contradictory behavior. So I saw today, I think Coca-Cola axing spend on advertising, around the world, and really pulling back and reining in their advertising spend. But then at the same time, I saw BMW are pivoting and making a big investment into esports. So there's two totally different approaches to how to, from big brands, global brands, of how to deal with that. So I think there's a really broad spectrum of responses, and a lot of it does come down to, the company's culture and appetite, and frankly, financial position as well. In terms of how I sort of try and keep up with this, it's hard because, like you, I seem to just be always reading newsletters from various different websites to try and keep myself informed of it, and looking out for really robust consumer data. So, Kantar have been doing a lot of really good stuff on this. There's been some good stuff from eConsultancy. There's been some good stuff from WARC as well. All of those things, have helped me to sort of try and figure out how to navigate it as well.
Right. Well, let's switch direction a little bit again, and maybe think about the future and what the future holds. And one of the questions I'm really maybe even obsessed about is what do we think has fundamentally changed? And I'm conscious, or might fundamentally change, and I'm conscious, obviously, that to ask that question is to ask someone to look into a crystal ball, and that we have truly no idea what will stick and what won't stick. But so I'm not looking for the correct answer, but I'm looking for what sort of trends you find interesting, or trends you say, hey, that's one you might want to keep an eye on, or even what's the way by which, again, back to the question of how do you sort of sort the signal from the noise? What can we do as marketers to be astute about the future?
Yeah. I've been looking back at some of the sort of previous crises, and I think it's pretty true across the board that each one of them becomes a catalyst for some kind of shift, small or large shift, in the way that people behave and in the way that culturally we perceive things. So if you, for example, think back to 9/11, the world was never the same after 9/11, not just because of the war on terror, but we all became, security conscious, right? So now it seems normal, but I don't know if you remember, before 9/11, you could pretty much walk through an airport quite easily, and it was, life was just easier getting on and off planes and going to the Statue of Liberty, and all of these things and our world changed, and that was coming, but the catalyst was that period. And so we moved into this kind of more security conscious world. During the recession, we moved into a world that was much more about the experience economy, right? So that term kind of came from that period when it dawned on us that, putting all of our time and effort to try and get material goods really probably wasn't the best way to live our lives. And so we started to see a shift in the behavior and thinking into the experience economy. And that took off from there. So I think this one will do that, and it will, and it's almost like, I think it's, the old kind of adoption bell curve, the diffusion of innovation curve. I think what's happening is that's been kind of squashed, and we're going to go through it just much quicker. And so the future is going to happen faster as a result of this. I don't think it's going to make anything happen that wasn't probably going to happen anyway at some point, but it will happen a lot faster. So the sorts of things, and you've probably got some thoughts on this as well, but the sorts of things I'm seeing, definitely, accelerated migration to digital platforms like we're doing now, and like our students are getting used to, but also, e-commerce, telemedicine, live streaming, like the China example I gave you. Though I don't think, I mean, to some extent there'll be a snapback to a degree, but a lot of that is here to stay, I think. Right.
And arguably, I think generationally, I mean, that's what's fascinated me. I've been on, several, birthday celebrations and, religious holiday celebrations and all sorts of different things where, older generations who, some of whom are very comfortable with technology, clearly others who are not, have kind of joined in by default, and now, too strong a word to say habituated, but at least have overcome that first barrier. It's hard to see folks going back from that in the sense, at least, that they don't have a mental barrier any longer, that it's too confusing or complicated or whatever, or just not valuable. The question, I think, on all of those kind of things will be that's true, but at the end of the day, they'd still want to be in person hugging the grandkids. If they had a choice, they're not going to, but maybe, maybe they're now a whole lot more comfortable jumping on a Skype call or FaceTiming, and they wouldn't have been before. So
I think it's interesting. I think you're right. It's degrees of impact, isn't it? It's so I was chatting to a friend of mine the other day. He travels on business around the world all the time, or has been.
Yeah.
And he does that because his boss is a big believer in that, and and wants it to happen. So I was chatting to him about it, and he says it's interesting. He said my boss's attitude has shifted, and he's now seen that we can actually be really productive doing all of this kind of thing. And so I said, well, what will that mean? And he said, I think what it'll mean is that when we go back, I bet a third of my business travel stops. So that's the impact. It's not like we're never going to get on planes again or go and meet friends. But it's more that, and if you think about that, if you play that out across the business travel industry, that's a big amount of business travel that could, if he was representative. So I think those things are really interesting. And I saw some data from eMarketer where they were talking about how, Q4 every year is a critical spike in e-commerce behavior because, everybody's trying to buy gifts online. And what happens is, the curve goes up in Q4, but it never drops back down again. It drops down a little bit in terms of preferred retail channel.
A new norm,
Yeah, but people shift. So there'll be that for sure.
That's really
but what do you think about health and kind of cautiousness about health? Do you think that's going to be a big thing?
Well, I do. I think that, there's a few things. One is I think we've, as a society, probably fundamentally underinvested in the healthcare system, and that seems to be as much true in the UK as in the US. And that's probably much more apparent to people now than it might have been before, or at least how disconnected a lot of the different elements of the health system are. And so one hopes and one assumes that from a policy level, some of the people pushing for, greater forms of funding or, greater accessibility will win the day on those things. I think as individuals and, our capacity to, deal with their own health issues or relate with doctors, via telemedicine, I think telemedicine has to have a significant future. Again, that seems to me one of those accelerating forces, that it was something already happening. I would think too that this might give a good vig to all of the healthcare wearables and what they broadly call the quantified self, or the digital health stuff, because people probably get that it doesn't hurt to be either self-monitor or have others monitoring you, and that there might be some public good in that. And the question back to you really is a balance between all of that data and all of that information and issues of privacy and or privacy, as we would say, privacy and and just the capacity to manage those things. So how do you in those conversations you're having with marketers, partly about the future, do you think marketers believe there's greater openness and opportunity to use and leverage data obviously responsibly, or do you think that will sort of go back to its pre-COVID days with a lot of anxiety, honestly, about the use of data?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I don't think people are going to be any less suspicious of of companies that are using their data. But what they might be willing to do is, there's always that trade-off, isn't there? That exchange that takes place when you're giving up data, and you want something in return. There could be a more altruistic thought. I'm just guessing here, but there could be a more altruistic thought process that, if it's framed in the right way, if you're sharing your data to help the kind of the greater good in terms of solving some of these issues, but companies still I think will have to demonstrate or that they are trustworthy, because those levels of trust are still really low, aren't they? I think the other thing on health, I work with a lot of brands, of course, in the entertainment, sports, tourism, travel sectors, and the level of reassurance that those types of companies are going to have to give now in terms of the precautions that they're taking. So think about going to a convention, right? What is it as a consumer you're going to want to know is being thought about, like spacing out of social distancing, sanitization, the provision of healthy food, those kinds of things start to become dialed up as well. And again, it's an accelerated thing. Like when I went to college, I'd never heard of hand sanitizer. And now every student seems to carry, even before this, a bottle of hand sanitizer around. So that was already something that was happening. I just think now we're going to be, the biggest consumers of hand sanitizer ever, the next generation. But
no, I think so. I also suggest there might be some very interesting market opportunities for new companies to emerge. This whole idea of certifying somehow that a place or an event was safe and healthy. One could imagine a new role for some of these health brands where you could see, especially if they have developed some forms of testing or some process by which they could ensure that, that, or even a new role for cities and municipalities to sort of designate certain things as post-COVID ready, to give you some kind of sense of surety. One obviously imagines that in a litigious society like ours, some companies will be loath to do that if anyone then ends up getting sick, but no, I think that represents a real opportunity and or a way that maybe that's an interesting thought, Simon, is we were moving toward this world in which brands were being encouraged to think of everybody should think about themselves as a service business. I think the mantra was at one point, and and I think maybe the world will move to a world where everybody's going to have to think about how to build that sort of sense of safety and concern into the brand. It's like the use of the brand brings you no harm, and that you can engage with it. That'd be a very interesting challenge. I think you can see certain categories in which and I think you mentioned it earlier around packaging and things like that. What happens to that world that gets everyone comfortable about The other question related to that is these very interesting tensions that were going on already between sort of globalism and localism, especially around food. There's a lot of there had been a whole movement towards local food markets and locally sourced food, and and did the world shift and say, that's nice, but I'm as concerned about the certainty of where my food's coming from and that it's gone through all the right kind of checks and balances. Do those trade-offs shift again? That will be an interesting one to watch, I think.
Definitely, this idea of radical localism and coming out of this, there's for sure already just a kind of a selfish reason for people not to want to go too far. So that's going to be there anyway from a health standpoint. And then, for some people, supporting their community is important as well. And then others have that environmental concern. So I think that's definitely something we'll see immediately. My question is, what happens when that runs up against a recession? To the broader population, because I think a lot of commentators are in fortunate positions where they can spend a bit more on groceries at Whole Foods and go to farmers markets and all of the rest of it. But when the mass market runs up against a recession, what trade-offs are they prepared to make then? And I think that's going to be an interesting one on that one.
Well, and I think you're right to point out that we may be having a very kind of East Coast, refined conversation here that, for a large number of people, that's not necessarily, a question of, whether they're going to get their organic kale or not. There are other, more significant needs. One last question about sort of some of the future-oriented things. It certainly doesn't have to be the last question, but, and I do want to reserve a little bit of time. I thought, Simon, we could talk about counsel for students or young, it doesn't have to be our students, but young emerging professionals looking for jobs, thinking about building capabilities at this time. I thought that might be interesting. But one question that I'm quite interested in, have been for many, many years, is what I think sometimes called as the generational impact of these things. So Mannheim was a famous sociologist. He talked about this idea of fundamental integrative attitudes that different generations had. So whether it's the greatest generation or the Vietnam generation, these tools that marketers, shorthand tools, arguably, the marketers use. Any sense, I mean, again, this is really, crystal ball stuff, but any sense that what you see happening will potentially form some very fundamental integrative attitudes for young or a certain generation? I guess the Generation Z is already being called the Zoom generation, conveniently, but do you buy into that, or do you think it's just not, either not big enough, or that well, maybe it's just too early to call? But any thoughts about, do you see the attitudes of a certain group of people, a generation that's emerging today, differing in meaningful ways from the rest of us?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought, and I think a lot will depend on how long this goes on, and if it becomes a kind of an era, or whether it's just an air pocket, right? And which ultimately becomes a recession, which then is no different to other recessions. But if it does go on, or if it changes behavior for a significant period of time, the way I've been thinking about this is, in the UK, my parents' generation was the post-war generation who went through that kind of period of rationing, right? That 5-year period after World War II, when they couldn't get things, and life was tough, and life was restricted, even though it was peacetime, and they had to, everything was rationed and all that kind of stuff. And it developed a kind of a psyche with that boomer generation in the UK, which then ultimately led to the 60s. So and good and bad. And I think so I could see something like that emerging if I was crystal balling.
Right.
If, with the sort of generation now that are going through this and are having to live with a restricted lifestyle, I could see that playing out if it went on for long enough. But fingers crossed it doesn't.
Right.
And we don't end up with that.
Yeah. Well, let's take a few minutes, and then I know we have a hard stop, but let's take a few minutes. Any thoughts you want to share? You know, if our students are tuning in, or young professionals, and I know you're very generous with your mentorship to your students, etc. What sort of advice are you giving them about navigating, you know, getting careers, advancing careers, whatever they need to think about right now?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I've been trying to say to people is, you know, to try to remain optimistic. That, you know, if you map out whichever metrics you want to use, if you map out these moments in time across the bigger picture of, you know, growth and opportunity, you know, there's an upward trend here, right? I was doing this with some tourism and hospitality students yesterday, with a fellow professor in that area, and you know, we just showed the incredibly compelling upward line of tourism around the world, despite all of these major events. So hang in there is the first thing. You know, things will ultimately get better, and I think the smart people are the ones who can look for opportunity and pivot, you know, while I mean, you know, it's the old thing about adaptability. If what you maybe plan to do, maybe in the light of this situation, isn't necessarily the right thing, and so, but can you pivot and adapt yourself to either go into an industry that is actually going to come out of this very well, or to go into a field of marketing which is going to be very strong. So for instance, you know, digital is, I teach digital marketing, as you know, and I think digital is, in fact, tomorrow we're talking about careers in digital marketing. I think the ability to work in the digital world has suddenly become even more important now. And I think looking for those opportunities is super important, and positioning yourself to respond to that.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, look, your time is really appreciated, and it was a great conversation. We ranged over a number of different topics, and I appreciate it. I'm gonna hit our pause for a second.